The lights inside the grand auditorium were blindingly bright, creating a wall of heat that seemed to separate the stage from the rest of the world. It was one of those quiet, heavy afternoons where the air feels thick with anticipation. The audience was packed tight, hundreds of people shifting in their velvet seats, whispering to one another. They were waiting for the next performer to walk out, but you could feel the skepticism in the room. It was the kind of skepticism that comes after a long day of watching people try and fail. On the panel sat the judges. They were veterans of the music world, people who had seen thousands of hopefuls walk across these wooden floorboards. They looked tired. The man in the middle sat with his chin resting on his hand, his eyes half closed as if he was ready to take a nap. The woman next to him was shuffling through her papers, looking bored and impatient. They had heard it all before, or so they thought. They were expecting another average performance, something they could politely nod at and then forget about 5 minutes later. They were not prepared for what was coming. The buzz in the room grew louder as the host stepped up to the microphone. He tapped it twice, sending a sharp feedback noise through the speakers that made everyone jump. He smiled, but there was a nervous look in his eyes. He announced that the next piece on the program was considered one of the most difficult compositions ever written for the piano. He used words like virtuoso and technical nightmare. He explained that even professional pianists with years of training often refused to play this piece in public because the risk of failure was too high. The music demanded speed, power, and a level of finger independence that seemed almost superhuman. As the host spoke, you could see the judges perk up a little bit. The man in the middle opened his eyes fully. The woman stopped shuffling her papers. They exchanged a look that said, "This is going to be a disaster." They knew the history of this music. They knew that the last 3 people who tried to play it on this stage had cracked under the pressure. One of them had even walked off in tears halfway through. The consensus among the music community was clear: this wasn't just hard, it was impossible for anyone to get right without years of grueling practice. The audience started to murmur again. People leaned forward, craning their necks to see who would be brave enough or foolish enough to attempt such a task. The atmosphere in the room shifted from boredom to a tense kind of curiosity. It was like watching a tightrope walker step out over a canyon. You want to look away, but you can't. The silence that fell over the theater was heavy. Every rustle of a candy wrapper or cough sounded like a thunderclap. The judges sat up straighter, ready to be critical. They were already preparing their comments in their heads. They were thinking about how they would explain to this poor contestant that you shouldn't bite off more than you can chew. The woman judge adjusted her glasses, sharpening her pencil to take notes. The man judge crossed his arms, a clear signal that he was not going to be easily impressed. They were the gatekeepers of this world, and they had built a wall of skepticism that no average musician could climb. Then, the side door opened. The light from the hallways spilled in, cutting through the stage gloom. A small figure stepped out. The contrast was instant. The stage was huge, designed to hold a full orchestra, but this figure was tiny. The whispers in the audience stopped instantly, replaced by a collective gasp. It was a child. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, wearing a slightly oversized suit that made him look even smaller. He seemed completely oblivious to the hundreds of pairs of eyes burning into him. The judges froze. The man in the middle dropped his hands onto the table with a thud. The woman's mouth opened slightly, her pencil hovering over her paper. They looked at each other, and then back at the boy. The mood in the room changed instantly. It wasn't just skepticism anymore, it was confusion and a touch of pity. It felt like a setup. It felt like a cruel joke that someone was playing on the judges. The audience thought the same thing. How could a child, someone who probably needed help tying his own shoes, possibly hope to conquer the monster that was waiting for him inside that piano? The boy reached the large, black grand piano sitting center stage. It looked like a giant beast next to him. He didn't look at the judges. He didn't look at the audience. He just focused on the bench. He climbed up, his little legs dangling above the floor. He had to scoot forward just to reach the keys. It was a comical sight, almost adorable, but no one was laughing. The silence was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. The judges were shaking their heads slowly. They had seen parents push their kids too far before, and they assumed this was another case of a child being forced to perform something he wasn't ready for. The tension in the room was unbearable. The man judge looked at his watch, mentally calculating how long it would take before the boy made a mistake and they could stop the audition. The woman judge softened her expression, looking at the child with sympathy, ready to comfort him when the music fell apart. No one in the room believed that a miracle was about to happen. In their minds, the story was already written. The boy would play a few notes, get confused, the judges would buzz him out, and he would walk off stage. It was going to be a sad, awkward moment that everyone would rather forget. But then, the boy placed his small, pale hands on the keys. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. He adjusted his posture, sitting up straight as if a string was pulling him from the top of his head. The audience held its collective breath. The judges leaned in, waiting for the first clumsy chord. For a second, time seemed to stand still. The disconnect between the impossible music and the tiny boy sitting there was massive. It seemed like a mismatch of nature. The air was thick with doubt, skepticism, and the heavy weight of everyone's expectations. They were all waiting for failure, completely unaware that the definition of impossible was about to be rewritten. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. The little boy sat perched on the immense leather bench, his feet swinging slightly back and forth because they couldn't reach the floor. From the audience's perspective, it looked almost ridiculous. It was like watching a toddler trying to drive a bus. The contrast was stark and, frankly, a little painful to watch. The grand piano loomed over him, a shiny black beast waiting to swallow him whole. The judges on the panel were no longer looking at him with skepticism, now they just looked tired and sympathetic. The man in the middle let out a long, quiet sigh, the kind you make when you know you are about to waste your time. He picked up his pen again, tapping it rhythmically against his notepad, ready to write a polite rejection note. To the judges, this wasn't an audition anymore, it was a social awkwardness they had to endure. They assumed the boy's parents were somewhere backstage, living vicariously through their child, pushing him into a spotlight he wasn't ready for. It was a story they had seen 1,000 times. The woman judge leaned over and whispered something to the person sitting next to her, probably guessing how long it would take before the boy started to cry or forgot the notes. The audience was shifting in their seats too. People were checking their watches, some were even whispering apologies to their neighbors, feeling bad for the kid who was clearly about to embarrass himself on national television. The boy, however, seemed completely unaware of the pity swirling around the room. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look at his parents in the crowd for reassurance. He just sat there, incredibly still, staring at the black and white keys as if they were old friends. He adjusted his hands, stretching his small fingers. They were so tiny that it seemed physically impossible for them to stretch more than a few keys at a time. The man judge shook his head again, a subtle motion that said, "This is going to be a disaster." He was already mentally preparing his script for when he had to buzz the boy off. He was thinking about how to gently tell a 6-year-old that the world's hardest piano piece was not a game. Then, without a word or a nod to the judges, the boy raised his hands high. For a split second, he hovered there, frozen. The room held its breath, waiting for the clumsy, off-key plinking that everyone expected. They were ready to wince. They were ready to feel second-hand embarrassment. But then, his hands came down. The sound that filled the auditorium wasn't a timid plink. It was a roar. The first chord struck with a power and authority that felt like a physical slap to the face. It was clean, precise, and shockingly loud. The man judge nearly jumped out of his seat, his pen slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the desk. The woman judge's head snapped up, her eyes widening instantly. The whispering in the audience stopped dead, cut off by the sheer volume and clarity of the sound. It wasn't the sound of a child fooling around. It was the sound of a master taking command. Before the shock of the first chord could even fade, the boy's right hand began to move. And when I say move, I don't mean the slow, deliberate movement of a beginner. I mean a blur of motion. His fingers danced across the keys with a speed that was mesmerizing. It was like watching a magic trick. You knew there were fingers there, but they were moving so fast that they almost disappeared. The notes weren't just random, they were the terrifyingly complex opening runs of the impossible piece the host had announced. The mood in the room shifted instantly. The pity vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp confusion. People stopped looking at their watches. They stopped checking their phones. Every pair of eyes in the theater was glued to the small boy on the bench. The judges leaned forward, their bodies tightening. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a burning need to understand what was happening. Was it a recording? Was he just hitting the right keys by accident? But no, as the music continued, it became clear that this was no accident. The music was flowing like a river. The left hand came in, providing a heavy, rhythmic bass that thumped in everyone's chests. The boy's face was calm, almost serene, completely focused. He wasn't struggling to remember the notes, he was inside the music. He was riding it. The contrast between his small body and the massive sound coming out of the piano was dizzying. It was as if the spirit of a giant had taken over the child. The judges were now exchanging glances that were completely different from before. There was no eye-rolling now. There was pure disbelief. The woman judge had dropped her pencil entirely and was staring with her mouth slightly open. The man judge had crossed his arms, but he wasn't relaxed anymore. He was gripping his own arms tightly, his brow furrowed as if he were trying to solve a difficult math problem in his head. He was a professional, a man who knew music inside and out, and he was hearing things that shouldn't have been possible. The complexity of the piece was starting to show itself. The music demanded jumps wide, leaps where the hand has to fly from one end of the keyboard to the other in a fraction of a second. Most adults miss these jumps. They land on wrong notes, and the music stumbles. But this boy, he nailed them. Every single time. His little hand would arc through the air and land with the precision of a laser, hitting the exact note with a sharp attack. It was effortless. It looked easy, which was the most shocking part of all. The audience began to lean in, a collective movement forward, drawn by the magnetism of the performance. The atmosphere in the hall was no longer bored or cynical. It was electric. The air was crackling with a strange energy. You could feel the heartbeat of the room speeding up. People were forgetting to breathe. The awkwardness of the child's size had melted away, replaced by a sense of awe. They weren't watching a cute kid anymore, they were witnessing a phenomenon. The boy's feet still dangled above the floor, looking comically out of place, but his hands were conducting a symphony of sound that was filling the massive space. The piece moved into a softer, more melodic section. The speed slowed down, and the boy's touch became incredibly gentle. He played the sweet, singing notes with a sensitivity that seemed too mature for his age. It was emotional. It had feeling. This wasn't just a robot playing fast notes, this was a human soul expressing something deep and beautiful. The woman judge put a hand over her heart, visibly moved. The cynical mask the judges wore had shattered completely. They were hooked. They were realizing, with every passing measure, that they were in the presence of something rare. Something that comes along once in a lifetime. The story they thought they knew, the one about the untalented kid, was being torn apart and rewritten in real time, note by perfect note. As the gentle melody faded into the air, the room remained suspended in a state of disbelief. The soft, sweet notes had acted like a spell, temporarily paralyzing the judges and the audience alike. But the boy didn't stop to take a bow. He didn't look up for approval. Instead, his fingers shifted position on the keys, and the mood of the music changed instantly. It was as if a dark cloud had rolled over the sun. The gentle rhythm transformed, morphing into something jagged, fast, and incredibly complex. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, but not like this. They were expecting the struggle. They were waiting for the music to fall apart. The man in the center judge's chair, who had been so ready to dismiss the performance, found himself leaning forward without even realizing it. His elbows rested on the table, his chin hovering just inches above the surface. The skepticism that had been etched into his face was slowly cracking, replaced by a look of intense concentration. He was a professional, a man who knew the mechanics of music better than anyone, and his brain was struggling to process what his ears were hearing. The notes were coming faster now. Much faster. They cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall of pearls, each one distinct, each one perfect. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. The boy's hands were moving with a fluidity that seemed almost impossible for a child whose muscles were still developing. Usually, when children play the piano, their movements are stiff and mechanical. They have to think about every single note. But this boy wasn't thinking. He was flowing. His wrists were loose, his fingers were curved perfectly, and he attacked the keys with a confidence that was terrifying to watch. The silence in the auditorium deepened. It was no longer just a lack of noise, it was a vacuum. The audience was frozen. Hundreds of people were holding their breath at the same time, creating a pressure in the room that made your ears pop. No one shifted in their seats. No one coughed. No one checked their phones. Every single pair of eyes was locked onto that small figure on the stage. They had come expecting a spectacle of failure, maybe a cute moment to laugh at later. Instead, they were witnessing a masterclass. The woman judge had completely stopped taking notes. Her notepad lay forgotten on the desk. She adjusted her glasses, leaning so far out of her chair that she was in danger of falling off. Her eyes were wide, scanning the boy's hands, trying to catch a mistake. Surely, he would slip up. Surely, a finger would cramp or a hand would get tired. But the mistake never came. She watched the left hand playing a slow, heavy bass line while the right hand executed rapid, trilling runs that seemed to fly off the keyboard. It was a level of coordination that most adults spend a lifetime trying to achieve and still fail. The look on her face shifted from confusion to pure, unadulterated shock. The music began to build in intensity. It was like a storm gathering strength. The heavy bass notes started to pound, shaking the floorboards. The boy's body began to sway slightly with the rhythm, rocking back and forth to generate momentum. His feet, still dangling uselessly above the pedals, couldn't reach them, so he was creating all the volume and power just with his hands. It was a physical feat. You could see the exertion in his small shoulders, but his face remained peaceful, locked in a zone of concentration that shut out the entire world. He wasn't aware of the judges anymore. He wasn't aware of the cameras or the crowd. It was just him and the instrument. The judges exchanged a glance that said everything. The man judge raised an eyebrow, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the woman judge, and she looked back at him. They didn't need to speak. They were both thinking the exact same thing. Who is this kid? The cynical walls they had built up over years of judging auditions were crumbling down brick by brick. They had seen prodigies before, sure. They had seen talented kids who could play a nice tune. But this was different. This wasn't just talent, this was a freak of nature. It was a level of genius that defied logic. The complexity of the piece was increasing with every measure. The music demanded that the hands cross over each other constantly, a technique that usually leads to disaster for young players. The boy's arms flew in front of and behind each other, weaving a complex tapestry of sound. There was a moment where his arms looked like a tangle of spaghetti, yet somehow, the music never stopped. It never faltered. The rhythm was rock solid, driving forward like a freight train. The audience was starting to feel a chill run down their spines. The atmosphere in the room had changed from pity to fear, a respectful fear of the raw talent displayed in front of them. People in the back rows stood up, craning their necks to see over the heads in front of them. They couldn't believe that the sound filling the massive hall was coming from a child. It was a paradox. The visual image of a small boy in a suit clashed violently with the auditory experience of a grand orchestral sound. It was messing with their minds. The man judge sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He looked defeated, but in a good way. He had lost the bet he had made in his own head. He had been proven wrong in the most spectacular way possible. As the section of music continued, the boy hit a run of notes that was so fast it sounded like a blur. It was the kind of passage that makes pianists sweat. He navigated it with the ease of someone walking down the street. The precision was startling. Every note was clear. Every tone was even. There was no mushy sound, no hitting of wrong notes. It was clinical, yet full of emotion. The judges were now sitting on the edge of their seats, completely captivated. They were no longer judges grading a contestant, they were fans witnessing a miracle. The realization had finally set in. The skepticism was gone. The doubt had evaporated. They were no longer thinking about how to stop the audition. They were terrified that the music would stop. They were leaning in, desperate to see where this journey was going, silently praying that the small boy could keep up the impossible pace he had set. The story was no longer about the cute kid who tried hard, it was about the giant who lived inside the small body, and the world was just starting to take notice. The music wasn't just playing anymore, it was attacking the air. The boy had entered the section of the piece that everyone called the graveyard for pianists. This was the part where the notes came so fast that they didn't sound like individual keys being pressed anymore, they blended into a single, continuous scream of sound. It was a wall of noise, beautiful and terrifying. The tempo was accelerating, pushing the limits of human speed. The boy's right hand was moving so fast that it looked like a blur, a ghostly vibration above the keyboard. If you blinked, you missed an entire measure of music. The audience, usually polite and restrained, was now completely losing its composure. A collective gasp swept through the room like a wave, followed by a low murmur of shock that you could actually hear over the silence between the beats. People were turning to each other, eyes wide, mouths open, pointing at the stage as if they couldn't believe their own eyes. They had come for a show, maybe expecting a little talent, but they were getting a lesson in physics. It seemed impossible for a human hand, let alone the hand of a 6-year-old, to move that independently. The boy's thumb was rolling under his fingers while his pinky stretched out, hitting notes that were inches apart, all while maintaining a rhythm that was driving like a jackhammer. The judges were now fully out of their seats. Literally. The man in the middle stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, but he didn't even notice. He walked closer to the edge of the desk, putting his hands on the surface, staring down at the boy as if he needed to be closer to verify that this was actually happening. The woman judge had taken off her glasses and was holding them in her hand, wiping her eyes with a tissue. It wasn't just the technical skill, it was the power. The volume was filling the entire auditorium, shaking the dust off the rafters. The boy wasn't gently tapping the keys anymore, he was attacking them, using the weight of his small arms to drive deep into the strings of the piano. What made it even more incredible was the physical limitation everyone could see. Most pianists use heavy footwork on the pedals to sustain the sound and make the music flow smoothly. The boy's feet were dangling high in the air. He couldn't reach the pedals at all. Every bit of the sustain, every connection between the notes, every smooth transition was being done entirely with his fingers. He had to hold the notes down longer and move his hands faster to compensate for the lack of pedal support. This was like watching someone run a marathon with their legs tied together while everyone else sprinted freely. It shouldn't have been possible, yet the sound was richer and fuller than what most adults could produce with all the help in the world. The storm of notes continued to build. The music was chaotic, a violent crash of sounds that represented the composer's anger and passion. The boy's body was swaying violently now, his hair bouncing around his face. He looked like he was in a trance, his eyes locked on his hands, his face intense but not panicked. He was conducting a hurricane. The audience could feel the vibrations of the piano in their chests. It was a physical experience, not just an auditory one. The deep, resonant bass notes thumped like a heartbeat, while the high notes danced above them like lightning. At one point, the boy's left hand had to play a series of jumps across the lower end of the piano while his right hand maintained a high-speed trill. His arms crossed and uncrossed in a constant blur of motion. It looked dangerous. It looked like he was going to crash into his own hands, causing a train wreck of sound. But the collision never happened. The coordination was flawless. It was like his brain had two separate engines running at the same time, controlling each limb independently. The man judge threw his hands up in the air, a gesture of total surrender. He looked at the other judges and shook his head, laughing in disbelief. It was a laugh of pure joy, the kind of laugh you let out when you see something so amazing that it resets your understanding of the world. The concentration on the boy's face was intense. His small tongue was sticking out slightly at the corner of his mouth, a sign of the immense focus he was exerting. He was sweating, you could see a small sheen on his forehead under the hot stage lights. But he never faltered. He never slowed down. If anything, as the music reached its peak, he played faster. He was challenging the piano to keep up with him. He was challenging the audience to keep breathing. The tension in the room was stretched so tight it felt like a rubber band ready to snap. Everyone was waiting for the mistake, the slip-up, the moment the human body would say enough. But the boy was a machine of music, unstoppable and relentless. The sound was swelling now, filling every corner of the vast hall. It was no longer just music, it was an emotional force. You could feel the sadness, the anger, and the triumph of the piece pouring out of the instrument. The boy had completely disappeared. In his place was a giant spirit, using his small hands to speak to the crowd. The people in the front row were physically recoiling from the intensity of the sound, leaning back in their seats but unable to look away. It was overwhelming. It was too much, and yet, it was exactly what everyone needed to see. The boy's hands were now a complete blur. The notes were cascading down like a waterfall of diamonds, shimmering and sharp. The difficulty of this section was something that only 1 in a million professional pianists could even attempt. To see a child doing it, and doing it with such ease, was humbling. It made the judges feel small. It made the audience feel like they had wasted their time doing anything else with their lives. This was the pinnacle of human potential, happening right in front of them, performed by a boy who was barely tall enough to go on the roller coaster at the fair. The storm inside the music reached its maximum intensity. The chords were crashing, the melody was screaming, and the rhythm was pounding. The boy was hitting the keys with such force that the piano was rocking slightly on its wheels. It was a display of raw power that contrasted sharply with his tiny frame. The man judge was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. The woman judge was standing with her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide as saucers. The entire room was on the edge of an explosion, waiting for the final release. They knew the end was coming, but they didn't want it to. They wanted to stay in this moment of suspended disbelief forever. The boy had taken them all on a journey, from skepticism to awe, and now they were trapped in the eye of the hurricane, waiting for the final thunder to strike. Then, it happened. The boy's hands rose high above his head, pausing for just a fraction of a second at the peak of the music's chaos. Then, they came down with the force of thunder. He struck the final chords, a crash of sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. It was a loud, decisive ending that demanded attention. And just like that, the music stopped. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise had been. The final note seemed to hang in the air like smoke, fading slowly, ringing in everyone's ears. The boy didn't move. His hands were still resting on the keys, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. His head was bowed. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the auditorium was completely dead silent. No one breathed. It was as if time had stopped, and everyone was trying to wake up from a dream. The human brain struggles to process things that don't fit its logic, and for a few moments, the judges and the audience were rebooting. They were trying to understand how a small child had just done what they had seen. Then, the dam broke. It started with a single person clapping in the back row, then another, and suddenly, the room erupted. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a roar. It was a chaotic, screaming wave of sound that rolled over the stage like a physical force. 500 people jumped to their feet at the exact same time. The sound was deafening. Strangers were hugging each other, laughing and shouting. People were wiping tears from their eyes, so moved by the performance that they couldn't control their emotions. It was the kind of reaction usually reserved for rock stars, not for a small boy in a suit playing classical music. On stage, the boy slowly pulled his hands away from the keys. The movement seemed to break the trance he was in. He looked up, blinking in the bright lights, looking confused by the noise. He turned his head to look at the audience, a shy, tentative smile creeping onto his face. He looked like a kid who had just woken up from a nap, realizing that the world around him had gone crazy. He slid back on the bench and hopped down to the floor, his feet finally touching the ground. The judges were in a state of absolute disarray. The man in the center wasn't leaning on the desk anymore, he was standing with his hands on his hips, looking at the boy with a mixture of shock and total respect. He turned to the woman judge and simply shook his head, his mouth open. He didn't need to say a word. His face said, "I have never seen anything like that in my life." The woman judge was frantically trying to fix her makeup, wiping away smudged mascara. She was laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the sheer talent she had just witnessed. The host walked onto the stage, looking a little dazed himself. He approached the boy as if he were approaching a bomb, unsure if he should hug him or just stand there. He knelt down on one knee so he could look the boy in the eye. He asked the boy how he felt, but the boy just shrugged, a tiny motion that made the audience laugh even louder. To him, it was just something he did. He didn't understand that he had just shattered the judge's perception of reality. He didn't know that he had played a piece that terrifies professionals. The man judge leaned into his microphone. He didn't use his usual polite, scripted opening. He didn't critique the posture or the dynamics. He just spoke straight from the heart. He told the boy, and the entire room, that he had been playing piano for 40 years. He said he had judged thousands of contestants, heard thousands of pieces of music. But he admitted, with complete honesty, that he had never, ever heard anything like what just happened. He called it a miracle. He told the boy that when he walked out, they thought he was a joke, but now, he was the master of the stage. The woman judge then spoke. Her voice was shaking. She said that she usually looks for technique or musicality, but with him, it was something else entirely. She said she felt like she was in the presence of history. She told him that he had a gift that couldn't be taught, a spark that couldn't be bought. She struggled to find the words, eventually just telling him that he made her believe in magic again. It wasn't just flattery, it was a genuine confession from a cynical person who had just been proven wrong in the most beautiful way possible. The applause continued for minutes. It didn't stop. The audience refused to sit down. They wanted more. They clapped until their hands were red and stinging. The boy stood there, taking it all in, looking small in the center of the giant stage but standing tall in spirit. He gave a small, awkward bow, almost tripping over his own feet, which only made the crowd love him more. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't showing off. He was just a kid who loved to play, and his passion had silenced a room full of doubters. The judges looked at each other one last time. There was no debate. There was no discussion needed. They didn't need to press a button or deliberate. The verdict was written all over their faces and in the sound of the crowd. They waved him forward, signaling that he had passed. But it was more than just a pass, he had won. He had conquered the impossible song. He had turned the "no one can play this" narrative into a memory. As the boy walked off the stage, clutching his sheet music, the lights dimmed. The buzz in the room didn't stop. People were still talking excitedly as they filed out of the exits. The story of the day had changed. It wasn't about the cynical judges or the difficult piece of music anymore. It was about the reminder that genius comes in all sizes. The judges sat back in their chairs, exhausted but happy. They knew they would remember this day for the rest of their lives. They came to judge a child, but in the end, the child had taught them a lesson about never underestimating the power of the human spirit. The boy might have been small, but his shadow was enormous, stretching over the entire concert hall, reminding everyone that sometimes, the impossible is just waiting for someone brave enough to touch the keys.